Welcome back to another episode of the Rock Your Comeback podcast. I'm your host, Nichole Eaton, author of the books Rock Your Soul and Rock Your Comeback, and I'm here to remind you of your power. And today I have one of the most magical energies I've had on my podcast. I'm so excited to introduce you guys to Susan Casey. She is an author, a grief and loss coach, a therapist, and host of the Rock Your Shine podcast. So welcome, Susan.
Thank you for having me, Nichole. I'm very excited to be here with you.
You have just the most gentle, loving, pure energy that I've connected with as a podcast guest. And I'm just so excited because I know that you have an incredible story and so much wisdom to share. But one of the things I like to ask my guests is, what is your definition of power?
I think my definition of power is when we understand that we are beings of light and that our inner core, who we are at our essence, is love. And when we embrace that and understand that, it drives all the decisions that we make in our life, and we emanate light into the world, and that creates healing. And so when I think about my own power, it's when I'm in alignment with my essence of love.
The question I always have for people who are talking about essence of love and light is, have you always been somebody who believed in light and essence of light and being a divine being, or is that something that found you?
I think that that's a beautiful question. You know, when I was little, I always knew that there was something more. I could feel it. I've always been deeply intuitive, though I wouldn't know, I wouldn't have the language for that. But I grew up very Catholic. And in the Catholic religion, it was very fear-based. And I remember thinking when I was little that something didn't make sense to me. And so I would say it was in my 20s when I went back to graduate school that's when I really delved more deeply into the afterlife and this idea of soul. And it opened up my world in so many different ways that we were so much more than what we see.
I think that's true for a lot of people, that there is an idea of what spirituality is or isn't presented to them at a young age or throughout their life. And then there's a moment that always arrives where we get to explore for ourselves, not be handed an idea, not have it pushed on us, but to truly say, does it feel right to me? How did you go from being in a space that was encouraging like this fear-based faith to questioning it? Because I think that feels scary to a lot of people when they start to question something that's like a foundation, especially for their life.
100%. Well, I went back to graduate school to get my master's in social work when I was 26 years old. So I was very young. And a friend of mine who was in graduate school was much older. And she's the one who first introduced to me this idea of the collective and what it means that we are all connected, and and we individuate in our bodies as soul. Our souls come here to learn about who we are, etc. And I remember feeling like my world had opened in this way that, because I need to backtrack. My father died when I was 10 months old. I was always curious about where he went. What does death mean? So that was a very important piece in my confusion growing up in the Catholic religion. And then when I was in grad school and I met this friend, and she really blew my mind. And then I started reading about shamanism, and I started to go to conferences, and I started, reading about people who had died and come back, the afterlife, near-death experiences. And it wasn't confusing as much as it was liberating. And that really put me on a whole different trajectory since I was in my early 20s, and has just continued to expand. And of course, now where we are in our world, I mean, we hear so much more about this stuff. I felt very closeted for many years when I would study all of these things: astrology, the afterlife, numerology, all of these shamanism, all of these different things. And now it's much more mainstream. The idea of channeling, mediums, all of these things back in the day were considered evil, quite frankly, especially in these various religions. And now it's open and people talk about it much more, and it's a very exciting time. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that was perfect. I think there is that curiosity that just sparks it. And if you follow that curiosity, and I think that's true about any part of your life, is that when you start to get curious about, what could be different? What do I want to learn more about? What intrigues me? And when we start to give ourselves permission to try something new, to read something new, to put in new thoughts, I think that's really a part of where our power comes from, is being open.
Absolutely. And you said, and being curious, because when we are curious, it takes us out of judgment, because judgment, is very restrictive. Curiosity is very expansive. The world is huge. There is so much going on around us, so much to learn, so many amazing people, so many conversations to have. And when we can remain curious, I think that it opens us up to following those breadcrumbs, following those, the things that light us up. And then it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger if we allow ourselves to follow that and not close ourselves down due to judgment or belief systems or something that we have hung on to that we learned when we were a child.
Yeah. I think what you just said is so beautiful, because we can carry our beliefs through to adulthood, and we can live by a set of beliefs that aren't in alignment for us unless we are open and curious and willing. I'm curious about, this podcast is called Rock Your Comeback. So I always like to dive into people's comeback stories. And I believe you have a really good one.
My brother, my younger brother, his name was nicknamed Rocky, birth name Brian. He was bigger than life. I know everybody says that about people in their world who have died, but he really was very charismatic. Physically, he was just beautiful. And he was also, when you talk, he was brave and curious, and he was a spa director, and he was a spa director on a cruise ship and fell in love with Bali, Indonesia. And he ended up moving there. And while he lived there, he got married to a beautiful Balinese woman, had a baby, and he started to get something called vertigo. And the doctors could not figure out where vertigo is when you feel dizzy. I mean, to make it really simple. And he lived with that for 3 years. And then he was over in Hong Kong, and he went there for a new job. He was going to open up spas across Asia, and he was still having this vertigo. And he went and saw a doctor in Bangkok, and they took him off Xanax. They had put him on Xanax as a temporary solution to help with the vertigo. One thing led to another, and with a 3-day span, he was in the hospital and he died. It was the most tragic thing that has ever happened in our family, but you can imagine, we're here in the States, he's over in Hong Kong. We do not know what is happening. My sister-in-law is also a doctor, and she talked to the doctor over in Hong Kong, who told us that he was having withdrawals and would make a full recovery. And 3 days later, we would find out a year later that he ended up having encephalitis of the brain. It swelled and he died. And
Wow.
So, yeah, it was crazy. And so my oldest brother and I flew over there, and we were there for 3 weeks. And I ended up writing a whole book on this experience called Rock On. And I interviewed people all over the world. And what was interesting is I had gone back from my master's in fine arts and writing, and I wrote my dissertation on writing through grief, loss, and trauma. So here I was in the darkest period of my life, and I decided to try my own theory, and I wrote myself through my own grief and trauma. It took me 3.5 years. I interviewed people all over the world, and it was as though my brother died every day. As I woke up and wrote, and I relived his death. But by the end of it, the healing that had taken place of really being with my grief, and of course, here I'm a therapist. I had been dealing with people with grief, loss, and trauma for, I've been in the field for over 30 years, trained clinical teams, but here I was living it. And anybody who has ever gone through a deep loss understands the terror that you're never going to feel joy again. I am a very joyful person. That's who I am at my core. And the sadness that I felt was so scary that the only thing that I could do was work on pure faith alone, and the research that writing through grief, loss, and trauma would help me heal. And that's what happened. And then his death has put me on a whole different trajectory. I do a grief and loss podcast. I quit my corporate job of 30 years. This is all I do now, is help people with their grief.
When I wrote Rock Your Comeback, I wrote a lot about what you're describing as a black hole moment. Those moments where we get sucked in and it just feels like, how am I ever going to feel okay again?
Yeah.
And it sounds like you had all the research in your pocket and you had all of this stuff. What did that process look like for you to even wake up and start? Because as we know about black hole moments, sometimes just getting out of bed is hard. Sometimes, like, how can people begin the process of writing their grief?
I think the first thing is to understand that when you have a deep loss, it takes, I always say that people hit a wall at 4 months because there's a lot to do after somebody dies. First of all, you're in shock. If it is a quick traumatic death, I think it's different if somebody is dying from cancer, where people have the opportunity to say what they need to say goodbye. You watch the one that you love suffering. So even though it is very traumatic and you still have to go grieve, you still have to go through a grieving process, there's also an element of closure when you get to say all the things. When someone dies suddenly or traumatically, people carry a lot of other things with them, sometimes guilt, sometimes shame. Totally depends on the relationship. What was the last conversation you had? But regardless of how somebody dies, there is this element of getting through the shock and getting through all of the things, the memorial service, all of the busyness. You've got people around you, you've got friends around you, and then people disappear and you're left alone with your grief. And so the first thing I would say is there is hope. You are not going to feel in this dark hole forever. You won't. And two, if you need to sleep, honor what you feel. Just honor it, because we've got to be able to sit with our grief. And third, make sure that you are doing the necessities, that you're sleeping, that you're eating, and if you need help, ask for it. I saw a grief counselor for a year. So I was writing my way through it. I was seeing somebody, and then I went and became a bereavement facilitator. And through that intense training, I also had to do my own grief work. So what I did was surrender to my grief, to my sadness. And I was also aware of when I needed help. Not everybody needs help, but if you do, reach out and ask for it and give yourself the grace to grieve. It's very seductive to want to run from our grief, to become a workaholic. Some people start to delve more deeply into drinking or drugs or anything to numb it. You cannot run from grief. The quickest way through grief is to allow yourself to feel the grief so it can actually move through your body. You've got to digest the emotion. And the only way you can do that is through the heart. And, and though it's counterintuitive, it also brings us closer to the person who has passed, if you believe in the afterlife.
That information will be helpful for so many, because I think there is like that, what do I do now? What do I do now? And, if you guys are in the middle of any kind of loss or grief, and I think loss and grief can be just as connected as with a hard passing as it is a breakup or a job loss. Like, I don't want to narrow down if you haven't had a major loss in terms of death. There are other tiny deaths that we experience, or big deaths that we experience when our lives change in big ways. So these are still really applicable tools for anybody going through a black hole moment, through a time where you're just feeling like, how do I get out of this? I want to break down the writing process, because that to me is super interesting. And it sounds like you did a ton of research. Mm-hmm. Is this type of writing, like, am I just writing whatever I think? Am I writing in a specific way? What do you recommend for people when it comes to writing with their grief?
That is an excellent question. But before I jump into that, I want to piggyback on something you just said that's really important, and I talk a lot about on my own podcast. Thank you for saying that the grief and loss process is certainly not just about the loss of a person. And I want to just stay here for a moment, if you don't mind, because first of all, since COVID, we were grieving on globally, and we are not great in our culture around honoring grief. And I think that we've done a horrific job since COVID. People had multiple losses during COVID. Multiple kids didn't get to go through graduation. Parents didn't get to see graduation. People had to put off their weddings. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The losses that people had during COVID. People have losses. I say this all the time. We're always grieving something, because with any ending, there is a new beginning. And so whether you're going through a divorce, sometimes it's loss of a dream. Sometimes you lose your job, as you said. It can feel very similar. A death of something is a death. A death is a death, no matter what it is. And so when, from a black hole, as you said, is a black hole. And when you are feeling hopeless or in a state of despair, all of the things are still true. Everything that we go through is temporary, always. The good stuff is temporary. The bad stuff is temporary. You got to just hold on and honor your process. And if you're not coming out of it, to know when it is time to get some help from a therapist, if you are affiliated with the church, from your priest or rabbi or whoever. So I just wanted to add that. In terms of writing, I love something called automatic writing. Maybe your listeners have heard of this. This is also where we get in touch with our soul. And automatic writing is literally when you sit and you start writing anything that you're feeling or you're thinking. Sometimes people can time it. People can sometimes, it really is just a matter of letting yourself free write. And when we do that, it gets us out of our head and into our heart. And that's where the healing really begins, as I said earlier. I think as humans, we like to think our way through everything. And there are some things that you cannot think your way through. You've got to feel your way through it. And that's what the writing allows you to do. So if you feel stuck, just keep writing. Just keep writing, I'm stuck. Write whatever is coming to you, because at some point you'll start writing from a deeper place. And you're a writer, and I think that you know what I mean. We call it getting into flow, where you get to a point where you're not thinking anymore. It's just literally pouring out of you.
When we're telling our truth, our uninhibited, unjudged truth, that is where the gold happens anyway. And that's where we fall back into alignment with our soul, is when we're able to be honest. Because I think, especially with how quick people want you to move forward and how quick people want you to just get over it, like whatever it is in your life that people just want you to be done and over it, and you feel like you should, that we're just saying, hey, this is actually where I'm at. And when you're giving yourself permission to be honest, there's just this beautiful alignment that happens with you, your thoughts, and your soul. And if you can do it in a way that doesn't involve you judging yourself for wherever you're at, and you meet yourself with compassion and love instead, man, that's powerful. And it gets you in touch with your intuition, which will give you better guidance steps to work your way out anyway. Like, I love automatic writing, but applying it to grief, I think it's a really powerful tool.
It is, because sometimes with grief, obviously, whether you've lost a job or lost a person or whatever it is you're grieving, or a pet, right? We can love our pets as much as we love our children. It's devastating to lose a pet. And I think that what it does, the name of my podcast is Rock Your Shine After You've Been Cracked Wide Open, because when we have a black hole, as you call it, when we've been cracked wide open, it is an opportunity to step inside of those dark places inside of our heart. It illuminates things that are there that we may not be aware of, which is why when we go through grief, it brings up so many other things that have been lying dormant that we weren't aware of. And it allows for deeper healing, and it allows us to get, as you just said, much more in tune with our intuition, with our higher purpose, if you will. Or people can close off to it. It's a choice when we get into that dark place.
I love this book. It's called Believe Bigger by Marshawn Daniels Lynch. And one of the quotes that she has that I actually wrote in my new book is, disruption is the invitation. And I live by that. I love that. I try to see things through that lens of when you are being disrupted in your life and things get shaken up, it is an invitation to unlock different parts of yourself. I'm curious, because you work so closely with grief, and a lot of people would probably be pretty mad at me for even posing this, but I'm going to.
Okay.
Do you feel like there is intention and purpose in the things we go through? Do you think they're fated to help us become something? I'm just curious your take on that.
So I think that everything that happens to us is for us. And what I mean by that is that we're human beings. We're going to go through painful experiences. We are going to lose people we love, because we are all here temporarily. And so though we would all love for our lives to follow this chronological order, born, we all die when we're 100 years old. We just know that's simply not true. We each have a different soul path while we're here. And so when I said, so you can have this belief system like, why do all of these horrible things keep happening to me? Or you can have this idea of everything that happens to me is for me. And what is it that I'm learning about myself in this experience that I'm having in this lifetime? What am I learning about myself? When someone dies, or we get a divorce or any of these other horrific things that can happen to us, it is that opportunity to think about, who am I? What lights me up? What do I want to do next? Because it's always a reminder of how temporary our life is. And what do we want to do while we're here? What do we want to accomplish? It doesn't mean we're not going to feel pain. We have to have the contrast to know what joy is and what brings us joy. And so that is how I try to live my life, especially after the loss of my brother. I learned so much about who I am, and his death was a catalyst to put me on this trajectory of what I'm doing now. And it sounds bizarre to think about working with grieving people brings me joy, but it does. Because when I think about my purpose, it's bringing light into the dark places. That's what I feel like I'm here to do. How could I do that if I didn't really experience it myself? So I feel like my brother's death, I feel like he is with me. I feel like we're doing this work together. And yeah, so I'm not sure if that answers your question.
That was perfect.
Yeah.
I just feel like when I look back in the times of my life and I look back at the really, really hard times, I know that I wouldn't be where I'm at if I didn't experience them. And if it didn't create this different part of me and this different level in me. And so when I think about this, and I also think it's really magical that those are the time periods where I did get closer to myself and closer to God, the universe, source. I think in the dark, if you can reach for faith, if you can reach for hope, if you can reach for whatever you're willing to believe in, even if it's just for the morning, that helps, that matters, and that creates momentum out. And I love that you've shared this story because you are a brilliant grief and loss coach, and you hold such compassionate, loving energy that I know if I was in a hard space that I would want to sit and live in, hang out in. And so I think your purpose was unlocked through your comeback. And that's why I love this podcast and love interviewing people like you, because we see people who are in certain positions, but they're there because of their hard black hole moment. They're there because they went through it. They're there because they know what it's like, because it wouldn't be really fair for you to sit with somebody and have somebody who sat with you who was in this space that you had no idea what it was even remotely like. And I do think that our purpose is well tied in that. And I do think that in the moments where we're in the dark is where the light speaks to us the loudest.
I agree with you. And I also think that we look to people as human beings. We need hope. We need to understand that we're never alone, that people have been where, when we're in the darkness, somebody has been there. Right.
Yeah.
And that's why your podcast, my podcast, other ones out there are stories to give people hope that, that the sun is going to rise again.
Yeah.
It will rise again. You are not going to feel this way forever, even though it feels like it in the moment, and I think that that's the biggest piece. And there are people who do give up, that they can really be sucked in and sucked under by profound despair. And that honestly, like that's what I care most about, is those people that are in that dark despair. Hang on, listen to other people's stories of rising out of that darkness. Go get help. There are so many people out there waiting to help you. And yeah.
And I know you're one of them. So if anybody feels called to reach out to Susan, we will drop all of her information in the show notes. But I know you have a 6-week grief and loss course coming up in the fall. How can people connect with you, and how can people sign up to that, get waitlisted for that if they're interested?
Yeah, I don't have the new dates. It's right now, it's to be announced. I'm not sure when I'm going to be, probably sometime in October. They can just go to my website, rockyourshine.com, spelled exactly the way you would think. And just in the contact, just fill out your name, your contact, and if you're interested.
Awesome. Is there any last final things on your heart that you feel called to share with the audience, or feel like they need to hear, or someone needs to hear today?
This is what I would say to all of you. Follow your passion. If you don't know what it is, spend some time with yourself, do some automatic dramatic writing. This life is about you experiencing joy, and there are always breadcrumbs. You're always being spoken to by your guides, by your angels. You are here to learn and follow what lights you up. We need people rocking their shine in this world, and life is way too short for you to be stuck anywhere that is not bringing you joy. Whether it's a relationship, a job, a home, you are meant to shine that beautiful light that lives inside of you.
You are such a blessing. You are just such a fantastic, loving, genuine energy. And I know people are going to want to connect with you, follow you on social media, and make sure you get subscribed to her podcast, Rock Your Shine. And I'm so grateful that you took time out of your day to chat with me about this, because I think as hard as it is to have conversations like this, and I like to keep things light and manifesting and stuff, but man, if you're in a dark spot, we got to get out of it. We have to be able and willing and have the confidence to have the tools to move through it. And I'm so grateful that you provided everybody with tools that they can use. And you're going to want to make sure you work with Susan, because she's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me
Nichole,
today.
thank you. I could say everything back at you. You are so delightful. I am so grateful that I got to meet you. And Nichole is a guest on my podcast too, and that's going to be coming out. But thank you for the work that you're doing. I cannot wait to read your book. It is en route to me now, and I'm looking forward to it. You're doing some amazing work in the world. Thank you.
I appreciate it.